Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the IPS-Nathan lecture series by Mr. Tan Chong Meng, our 14th S.R. Nathan Fellow for the Study of Singapore. Today, Mr. Tan will be delivering his second lecture titled Mega Maritime Movements, Adjustments in Orbit. Following his lecture, Mr. Tan will take questions from the audience in the Q&A session. The Q&A session will be chaired by Mr. Marcus Lam, Executive Chairman of PwC Singapore. Before we begin, please allow me to go over some housekeeping rules for the event. Thank you for joining us at the auditorium today. Please be reminded to switch your mobile phones to silent mode. The lecture is being streamed live on Facebook. It will also be recorded and uploaded onto our IPS website and our social media platforms later. Please submit your comments and questions at any time during the lecture through the Facebook comment box. For our audience members here at the auditorium today, please step up to the mic during the Q&A session to ask your questions. We will try our best to answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A. We would also like to hear your views on the event. There will be a link in the feed and QR code at the end of the lecture for submitting your feedback. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Tan Chong Meng to begin his second lecture titled Mega Maritime Movements, Adjustments in Orbit. Mr. Tan, please.
Thank you, Kaisin, and Director, and everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, whether it's in the auditorium or online, and especially those who came for a second dose, thank you for coming again. So last time I spoke, the first lecture, we covered the history of trade. We covered also how globalization, trade, industrialization all kind of work together interactively to create a set of circumstances for countries and the world to kind of push themselves forward with economic growth. With industrialization, with technology, the conditions became better, stronger, and countries took advantage of this, with Europe leading the way earlier on with their own economic growth spurt, followed by the US, subsequently Asia. And of course, then Singapore had its own story, its own journey charted amidst all this, and evolved to move towards the top and to stay at the top of global maritime trade. So my thesis last time, and why I used the imagery of escape velocity, orbit, and so was that global trade provides the conditions by which countries can attempt to create economic growth conditions that are like trying to shoot for the moon, but many land into a particular orbit. The question now for us is, what are the things we need to do to stay in the right orbit and the adjustments that need to be made? Now, firstly, I would also say that to prepare the successive lectures, there are more components to be explored and more things to be discussed. So the number of people who have helped me to prepare the second lecture has expanded. I thought I should point out. Other than Kaisin and Charmaine from IPS and my previous colleagues from PSA, I also have the help of people from MPA. So sometimes when I say we, it's because they've written the word we, but I speak also very passionately for whatever MPA is doing. So there's Benjamin Wong and there's Lei Ping and Wingen. Thank you very much. Right, without further ado, there were two questions from the first lecture that I want to recount and address as I go through this second lecture. One, as Shanghai consistently maintains a lead over Singapore in port status, why is that the case? And what lessons should Singapore glean to stay competitive? And in the discussion last lecture, I did give an account of the characteristics that Shanghai prospered within. So it's a huge hinterland, there's growth of China, quite different backdrop. But I will also go in a little further today to look at how Singapore has forged its own brand of an international maritime center. Okay. The second question is, furthermore, considering the growing trend towards market bifurcation, how will this affect our existing hub model? So indeed, a hub model must be resilient and agnostic of the trade and business models in the world. if it were possible. But to be realistic, it can only be resilient if it identifies the changes in the environment as and when they occur, preferably before, but certainly must keep up with the demands of customers and the way the world wants to trade. So there are numerous measures that need to be taken for Singapore to constantly remain as a top maritime hub, be it a key connector in global supply chains, so for the trade activity, or as an international maritime center. I'm going to touch on that more deeply later. So like a duck that needs to paddle very hard to remain afloat and move forward, so it is like Singapore has to keep evolving in order to stay relevant. Today we go a little bit underwater and look at how the legs of the duck are paddling, right? Hence adjustments in orbit. We start by asking the question, is the global age, a golden era of globalization over? So this chart shows the world trade as a percent of world GDP for a fairly long period, from 1970 to 2021. And you see, for a lot of this period, there was a very strong uptick of global trade as a percentage of GDP, from about 25% to about 65%, just at around about 2009, 8-9, the global financial crisis. And then during the global financial crisis, there's a kink, and after that, the slope is somewhat different. Now, if you think about the question, the golden era of globalization, is it over? Is somewhat, as a general question, is somewhat paradoxical. Because isn't it that with each turn of the technological innovation wheel, people are increasingly connected and more globally aware? So perhaps the question is more a reflection of the heightened state of geopolitical tensions. That says it must have a negative effect on globalization. But if we skip the general question and focus the question just on global trade and examine things more fundamentally over a longer period of time, with hindsight and as just interpreting the data from this chart, are there telltale signs of paradigm shifts over this period that global trade has changed? Especially if you look at the contrast before and after the global financial crisis. The GFC came after a number of years of strong economic growth, accompanied by high levels of borrowing, attractive interest rates, unsustainable property bubble as a result, and subprime debt practices. And what started in the US exposed banking weaknesses in many other economies, and the reactions were widespread and severe. So with these origins, the GFC itself was characterized as a financial crisis. But if we look beyond this, over that same period, to other signs or other signals, perhaps something deeper is afoot. At this point, I just want to quote from Bill Gates. He said, "People often overestimate what will happen in the next 2 years and underestimate what will happen in 10. So basically, we are more consumed by what's happening around us right now in the short term and perhaps missed out on the signals for the longer term. So let's look at some of the signals. Right? This was what people were consumed by during that time. But before and after, these were the images from St. Peter's Square. The one on the left in 2005 is what it looked like at the time of the election of Pope Benedict. And then 2013, Pope Francis. 8 years separating them, but quite a different picture. And very pervasive too, one very dark and one spots of brightness. How about another picture? This is the so-called 10-year challenge picture on the world's top public listed companies, comparing between 2008 and 2018. And you see in 2008, the top companies were still very much the resource holding companies, reflecting the drivers of economic growth of the few decades before that, where the world grew on production, consumption, on manufacturing, on a resource-based set of circumstances. And you see PetroChina, Exxon, GE, and so on. So resource, engineering, manufacturing were key. And you fast forward 10 years, and the list is totally different. I mean, if it's somewhat different, that's okay. If there are a few that were lurking in one and then after that reappear in the other, that's great too. But really very different. Well, predominantly technology companies. So it wasn't just the immediate impact of GFC and the way it reset certain things in terms of practices in the world, but it also signaled a period where things were dramatically different. Somewhere in the middle of this last decade, around 2016, the articulation of IR 4.0 captured global attention. As a neat way of packaging and explaining the phenomena being witnessed, but the data suggests, if you look at one of my earlier slide, that the genesis was actually some years prior. But with the pronouncement of IR 4.0, global players began to realize, sit up, take notice, and decided that the changes and shifts were indeed more substantive and persistent than initially thought. And more joined the bandwagon of using technology as a disruptor or enabler, and startup was indeed the goal to go towards. There was a time in 2016, 2017, when you travel around the world, the word smart, or AI-enabled, started appearing in many advertisements. And many of these claims were just smart washing. There was one of the airlines in a European domestic airline where they even have a smart class. Business, economy, smart class, so you figure out where it fits. And one of my colleagues even made a joke of it, I remember, saying that AI in Chinese dialect is gei kiang, pretending to be intelligent. So I was still unsure. Where will this go? VR, AR, and big data, and so on. But one thing in business, we all realize that from global history, technology is a perpetual. Meaning that once a new technology is released into the world, it is very hard to put the genie back in the box. So as time progressed, we started to witness the industrial transformation that it promised. In manufacturing, this is characterized by increasing automation and the employment of smart machines and smart factories. And across the value chains, informed data helps in the production of goods in a more efficient and productive manner. Beyond manufacturing, it gave wings to a digitally enhanced service economy that is able to respond to new customer demands, new consumer demands, like what you saw in the St. Peter's Square example. In social, entertainment, financial, commercial, hospitality services, the list goes on. The drivers of world trade had changed. And if you were to look at how it started to make an impact, or it has made an impact, in the GDP compositions of countries, let's just look at two, China and Singapore. First, China. The chart on the left shows the GDP contribution of manufacturing value add, on the right, services. And you see that before and after the GFC, the numbers are dramatically different. Manufacturing and services respectively comprise 32% and 41% before the GFC, and after that, 28% and 53%. So a big rise in the service percentage. The same it is for Singapore. Very similar chart. Now what you see here is symptomatic of a global pivot that is witnessed not just in the fortunes of companies like the 10-year challenge or national GDP like China, Singapore, but also reflected in maritime trade intensity. And so that starts to impact how we make decisions to ensure that our port, our value, our logistics, our supply chain activities remain in sync with the demands of the world. A very key chart is this, right? That the global pivots that we saw are also reflected in impacting maritime trade intensity. Now, what is maritime trade intensity? In the last lecture, I introduced this concept. It's not that easy because it's one that is used more by the people within the industry, so I will explain it again. Now, to create a certain amount of GDP growth, over time, there has been a relationship between GDP growth percentage and trade growth percentage. In the past, before the GFC, as you see, the bars, the vertical bars that reflected trade growth, global container port throughput growth, are all in double digits. Taken as a ratio of GDP growth, the multiplier in that decade is about 2.6. Going through the GFC, it goes through a bit of wobbles, as can be expected. But in the last decade after GFC, not only have the absolute numbers of growth come down in trade, but their relationship to GDP has also become more normalized. Now, you could argue that the 2.6 was rather souped up, and the 1 is a bit more normal, but it's also reflecting the fact that GDP now has another engine called services. So for all that reason, one needs to be more moderate in our expectation of where trade will head, both in terms of the link to GDP and as an absolute growth number in itself. So things have changed, and in hindsight, this is very clear. But when you are sitting in the industry in 2011, nobody shows you this chart of the future as history, right? So after the GFC, let's recall what took place in the shipping industry. How did they react? Now, the global financial crisis meant that freight and charter rates were plunging, leading to huge job cuts, and ships were being idle for months at a time. But shipping has been a very resilient industry that has gone through bust, boom, with each time growth coming out of the bust being stronger than the last. So after the GFC, the shipping industry decided it's time to invest again. The tried and used formula of the past, upscaling of ships, was one of the first thing that happened. So you see in 2006, the ships of a certain size, the length of the ship as drawn on the left-hand side of the picture depicts the length of the ship, but also the capacity in TEUs. So from 2006, you see the capacity is 11,000 TEU. 2012, it jumps to 16. That would be clearly in the megaship territory. And then after that, it continued to grow until about 24,000 TEU today. So upscaling in terms of size of the ship and also in terms of fleet, creating total overcapacity. It's also an arms race. When one company starts to order, another company wants to make sure that they don't miss out. Now, one observation here which you may make is you see that the ships double in size every about 10 or 15 years. It's a huge problem for ports because ports are built for 25, 30-year life cycle. So there's a huge mismatch. I will come to that. But for the shipping industry themselves, overcapacity is bad news. After a couple of years of reasonably good fortunes, profitably plunge in this manner, reaching a low in 15, 16, and even 2017. So seeing such bad losses, with the experience of very tough times, there was a massive wave of restructuring such as have never been seen before. Consolidations, and because of the large ships, operations had to become different, and I'll touch on that later. So much was the hardship that the industry had to find a special way to express it that they call it 6 weddings and a funeral. It's not very flattering. I don't like to use the word funeral, but I didn't invent it. This was what was said in the industry at the time. So the weddings. When things were at their most dire, and we felt it here on our own shores, shipping lines started to either be acquired or be sold. And we sold NOL in late 2015. You see the upper right. And then there was a merger of COSCO and China Shipping, which were the two Chinese shipping lines, into one large Chinese shipping company. And that was in 2015. Industry profitability did not improve. Further consolidations took place, and the other four weddings all took place in 2017. Maersk with Hamburg Süd, the merger of the three Japanese shipping lines into ONE, into one. That's not a pun, it's just truly ONE, One Ocean Network Express. Hapag-Lloyd's merger with USC, and COSCO's acquisition of OOCL, Orient Overseas Container Lines, completed that top list. And somewhere in between that 15 and 17, there was a funeral. So Hanjin Shipping was declared bankrupt with huge repercussions in shipping and to supply chain and to cargo owners. I also mentioned that because of the scale of the ships, it's like the Airbus 380. It's very hard for a single airline to fill such a big ship. It's also very hard for a single shipping line to run very large ships and to fill all of them and use it at high utilization. So alliances were formed, each contributing a few megaships to form a circuit around the world. It is not a new practice. It is a practice that has been there for asset utilization. But because of the high degree of concentration, market concentration, that had already taken place because of the restructuring and divestments and acquisitions, this new alliancing wave, where it ended up is such that three alliances dominated about 81% of global container shipping capacity. Now, it's hard for me to recall, as much as I try to think it through, where there's been such a high level of market concentration over such a short period of historical time. So shipping was going through its St. Peter Square moment within a shorter period. In 2007, you see one of the workhorses, MSC Xi'an, was about 90,000 tons dead weight, about 8,000 TEU. And it would ply short routes, medium regional routes, as well as long hauls. And then 2016, this was the MSC Oscar was the new workhorse. And that would be almost 20,000 TEU, 2.5 times the size of MSC Xi'an. The other thing I would have you notice, is the colors of containers on the ships. On Xi'an, it was very much MSC-owned boxes, red and yellow. And on the right, MSC Oscar, because of the alliances, it become more psychedelic. Right? It reflects the colors of their alliance partners. So let me use an everyday example. Last lecture, I introduced using this example of grocery shopping. Just think about grocery shopping. Typically, people would buy what they need fairly frequently, depending on what is it you're buying. Maybe the size of your store capacity, storage capacity, your fridge, your pantry, your storeroom, whatever, and the perishability of the items. Let's say on average once a week. And your logistics, your storage, I'm talking supply chain now, right, are patterned accordingly. Say now, you decide to buy only once every 3 months. You go to a grocery store once every 3 months, and it's not because of COVID, because you feel, I want to do mega shopping. What will you need to change? Your fridge, your storeroom, even maybe have a small forklift. Now, the same it is with these ships. If a single mega ship were to unload all its containers, and I'm talking about, say, MSC Oscar, line the containers up end to end, it will form a line about 140 kilometers long, one ship. And many of such ships berth in Singapore at any one given time, right? So that 140 kilometers is 3 times east to west Singapore. And finding a container along that line is like finding a needle in a proverbial haystack. Yeah? So the haystack got bigger, the needle is the same size, so go find something, right? Except it is also now multicolored. So there's no choice but to ensure that the port is ready as the first market response, that the port must, regardless of whatever the major trends, mega trends, you must be able to serve the new ships, right? So all this had huge implications. PSA, together with MPA, working together, pushed forward with the Pasir Panjang Phase 2 expansion in 2014, 2015, responding to all this. And you increase the number of cranes, you increase the depth, and you increase the overall scale and efficiency of things. This is the shape of things of the past. Ships are smaller, cranes are smaller. The Tanjong Pagar terminal, built in 2004, this was completed then. And this is Pasir Panjang 2018. And just to make sure that you notice the difference, we've helped to paint a couple of things on it. Yep. So see the big ship on one side and a relatively small one on the other side. And then the yellow lines also show how far the outreach of the cranes were. Quite different. The whole plan was accelerated, cost us billions. But what it gave were 2.5 times more berth in Singapore capable of handling megaships within a short space of about 4 to 5 years. Now, the business model also had to change because we are talking not just about physical compatibility, but the ability of the port, because we're a transshipment port, to play an efficient role within that finding the needle in the haystack syndrome, part of their global logistics product that they sell to their customers. And I say they, I mean the shipping lines. So we changed our business model from transactional to partnership. And in 2016, 2017, we formed joint ventures with COSCO, CMA, and ONE, on top of the joint venture with MSC that was already there, pre-existing in the first place. Now, the reason for these new partnerships is these are shipping lines who are players in the new suites of alliances. And so by working closely with them, we're effectively working closely with all the members and partners of that particular alliance. So from transactional relationships to strategic partnerships. Internal, within PSA, there was a movement called from node to network. Okay? Business model had to change because the stakes had increased for all. When you have market concentration, the movement of any customer business becomes even more dramatic in its impact. And so in 2016, we put in place those joint ventures. By 2017, you find that the market share of Singapore within the Straits of Malacca had grown once again because we were physically of the appropriate capacity, had better capability, and also had the better business model. So you see some headlines showing how Port Klang business actually suffered in 2017. I said just now that given the fast change within the shipping industry, there was no time to reflect on mega trends. Our first thing is let's keep our business. Let's be defensive while we are working on longer-term responses. But longer term, what are the challenges then? This is a very interesting book that was published by McKinsey. It was written by Richard Dobbs, James Manica, and Jonathan Wurtzel, McKinsey consultants in McKinsey Global Institute in 2015. The title is No Ordinary Disruption, and the subtitle is The 4 Global Forces Breaking All Trends. The challenge in the book is, have you got your assumptions right? The assumptions that you used to run your business for the last 2 to 3 decades, are they still relevant and appropriate? On their website, the intro to the book reads as follows. The world not only feels different, the data tells us it is different. And the book argues that it is timely and important to reset our intuition as a result of 4 forces colliding and transforming global economy. 1, the rise of emerging markets. And so this was written just after the decade of China becoming the global factory. So certainly had the impact of that. But I think the book also foretold the other emerging markets like India and so on. The accelerating impact of technology on the natural forces of market competition. 3, an aging world population And 4, accelerating flows of trade, capital, people, and data. The 4 mobilities I discussed in the first lecture. It's interesting, I find, that climate change was not yet highlighted as one of the 4 forces, or maybe even at least identified as a force number 5. But what was clear was they acknowledged disruption is here to stay. IR 4.0 is anchored in. And we started to ask ourselves, what is the evidence that it is not just something you write about, but something that's going to impact the marketplace? And during that, I remember 2016, 2017 year, within the company, we started to challenge ourselves. Do we understand what's going on? You know, the ports are formed in an old economy world. And when you start to see things that are pointing you towards a new economy, is try to associate how new economy outcomes can affect all the things and capabilities that you have created, whether it's automation, your process capability, you know, your business commercial models and all that, whether all this would still be relevant and resilient within the new economy. But first, you have to ask yourself, how would new economy work? So what were people talking about at that time? IR 4.0, a lot of those things. In the marketplace, one example I like is the Adidas Speed Factory. Now, they no longer use it, I have to say, right up front. So those of you who, when you see it and you know about the Speed Factory, you're talking about the past. It's a relic. Actually, Adidas did learn, I believe, quite a lot from it. But at that time, it was a bit of a rave, because here is something that then 3D print a shoe. Now, typically, a shoe would be manufactured from a number of different parts. And there's one country that makes the laces, there's one country that makes the top, and then maybe it's a leather piece, the sole, and maybe that comes together in a place of assembly. But here is 3D printed by that machine. There are 2 of them in Ansbach, Germany, and in Atlanta, USA. And when I heard about it, I said, I got to get one of those. Right? So it was a first edition, special first edition, first run. And I bought that shoe because it was my size, and it has a serial number of 006. It's not on Carousel. I still have it. It was quite interesting, I thought quite unique at the time. And it was launched in the Christmas of 2016. And then they learned quite a lot from it. And subsequently, they found that it was not sustainable. But why it captured my imagination was, can you imagine, we were already starting to talk about circular economy. So today, buying a shoe and using a shoe is one where you go to a store or maybe online, you pick something out and you buy it and use it to extinction, or maybe it finds its place somewhere and start to rot, but okay. But you own the shoe, and the shoe is not subject to a second life. But imagine if with the machine, you can go someplace after 3 or 4 months of usage, surrender the shoe and have it recycled into a new shoe of a pattern of your choice while you're having a cup of coffee, and you pay for the usage of the shoe for the next 4 months. I mean, you know, we can dream, but that was not to be, but at that time, that was the rave. And then e-commerce, of course. A digital marketplace. Retail was being revamped, B2C e-commerce, and then, of course, after that, B2B e-commerce. Huge enabler, continues to grow and tick upwards. And we also saw that because of digital disruption, I should tell this story about e-commerce. I was an e-commerce noob in 2017. I think my colleagues knew that, and they created this initiative called Shop Hard and say, you are forced to go buy something at e-commerce. I did. I used my daughter's account and bought a battle rope. The person showed up at the gate and was looking for Nicole because I used her account. It's not so long ago, but it was on an upward track already at the time. And because of all these very fast disruptions, industry cross-integration had begun. And what is industry cross-integration? We're used to thinking of vertical and horizontal. But here's one where people from different industries actually come together on uncommon ground to forge a new alliance. So you have, like, for instance, Alibaba getting into the logistics arena with China in 2013, Amazon Logistics, we all know, and then the traditional shipping lines who have their own logistics service provider business teaming up with this. So it was all happening. And I was concerned that in the ports industry, if we only stuck in the, doing the stevedoring activity and not be in touch with the cargo, just container, we would cease to be relevant. So how do we respond to this? Knowing it, yes, getting the feel that there is some evidence of a longer term change. Okay, but how do we respond? I would say broadly at two levels. One at the whole of system level, and two at the level of market operators. At the national level, Singapore MPA recognized as well that as a maritime nation, all these disruptions were challenging us if we stayed only as a hub port facilitating goods transfer. And we had to augment this by being a hub for both goods and services, i.e. an international maritime center. But before I jump into the IMC story, let's look at what constitutes Maritime Singapore. Maritime Singapore has two engines of growth. On the left side, the global hub port, chalking up records in terms of container transshipment activity, in terms of bunkering, and we surpassed 3 billion gross arrival tonnage for the first time last year. So all these are huge achievements and great accolades. But on the right-hand side, the other part of the IMC, where businesses prefer a one-stop shop for different services in finance, law, and operations, the IMC in Singapore also offers a maritime version of such an international shipping package. So you can view our vibrant IMC as a one-stop shop offering an ecosystem of complementary services ranging from what you see in that wheel there, ship registration, ship management, finance to maritime arbitration, and maritime insurance. The building of the IMC is not by chance, but through the concerted efforts led by MPA and multiple stakeholders in industry, unions, and academia. Look at what has happened. I must apologize when I saw this chart actually on the big screen. I hope you can see the numbers from the back. That just 2 decades ago, the presence of international shipping groups were just double-digit. But today, we are home to over 180 of such groups. That's in the second line. And you see the Singapore Registry of Ships, how much gross tonnage. And the presence of ancillary service providers such as shipbroking firms, banks with shipping portfolios, marine insurers, and maritime law firms have also grown by significant numbers, multiples. Now, what's also very interesting is we are seeing the birth of new maritime growth areas like marine tech startups. Yeah, earlier on, you didn't see, there's none at all listed, but today we have about 100 maritime startups under Pier 71, an incubation program set up by MPA and NUS. So today Singapore is a leading IMC globally, not because we say so, but because we've been judged to be so, topping international benchmarks like Xinhua Baltic Report for the 10th consecutive year in 2023, and coming in first for the Menon rankings, the Menon DNV report. Next week is Singapore Maritime Week, so there'll be another report card from Menon DNV, so look out for that. Fingers crossed, I wish MPA well. But this, how they measure is along the lines of a number of benchmarks. Xinhua Baltic Report looks at port factors such as cargo throughput, shipping services, and general business environment, a bit more generic. The DNV report actually breaks it down into shipping, finance and law, marine tech, port logistics, and competitiveness. Now, if we take a closer look at the benchmarks, you find that Singapore has strengths kind of polka-dotted across the different dimensions. Quite well-rounded, you may say. But maybe it is important to look a little closer at what are the other contenders and appreciate what is strong about those locations and also appreciate the differences between us. So Rotterdam and Shanghai are two names on the list. Their strengths are as big ports with their large hinterlands in Europe, in China, respectively. And while Singapore does not have a sizable domestic hinterland, Singapore Port tries to make the world our hinterland. And this I quote Mr. S. Rajaratnam, our First Minister for Foreign Affairs. If you look at the cargo composition, it is very clear. The local volumes in Rotterdam constitute 60% of their throughput, in Shanghai 88%, and Singapore significantly lower, 12 to 15%, because the large part is transshipment. For the other two top-ranking maritime cities, London is strong in professional services, ranking second in maritime finance and law, while Tokyo performs well as a shipping center for growing segments in LNG carriers and other alternative fuel-capable tonnage. So quite a lot of things to consider, but from the perspective of a single IMC, I would say Singapore has done really well to have performed with excellence in its core strengths, as well as to be a satisfactory service provider in all the other dimensions. Yes, it looks like we are ahead, but that's because MPA and the related stakeholders, they assure me, regularly ask themselves that are the plans, focus, and measures enough? And if you look at the actions, they certainly do a very diligent job at trying to anticipate the future. Because there are still continuing disruptive forces, and while we have Tuas Port of the future, we must make sure that the IMC strategy keeps Singapore as a whole maritime center, not just a port, resilient, and that the Singapore Sea Transport ITM does ensure that the local industry players are all transforming at pace. Because one thing to serve the international business groups with great strategies and great infrastructure, but if the companies are not evolving and if manpower is not being upskilled and so on, we would not have something that we can deliver with excellence on a sustainable basis. So one of the three foundational strategies is Tuas Port. The berths have started progressively coming online since 2022. Within a few years, you will see the vacation of City Terminal and more concentration in Tuas Port. The container activities will be consolidated in a single location with greater efficiency and greater capability of exchange between the players in the shipping lines, among shipping lines. And when completed, it will be the largest and most automated, more importantly, the best connected port in the world. It will also have hinterland connection. Unlike the city terminals, unlike Pasir Panjang, it will have hinterland logistic connections with the industrial park just behind it that is under the watch of JTC. So the other two strategies are IMC 2030 strategy and the Sea Transport ITM. Recognizing the emergence of new technology and changing economic conditions, both of these strategies look at ultimately capitalizing on emerging Industry 4.0 technologies to enhance operational efficiencies and to develop a future-ready maritime workforce. To continue on this momentum, MPA has recently refreshed the ITM. Announced a couple of years ago by DPM Heng, the refreshed Sea Transport Sector ITM for 2025 aimed to create 1,000 good jobs for local, and job opportunities will be based not just on paper qualifications, so a great focus on manpower skill and upgrading. The refresh ITM also aims to grow the sea transport value add by $2 billion by 2025, with an emphasis on innovation, human capital development, and resilience. Again, is this sufficient? Because the disruption that is happening is deep and continuous and evolving, and there are new factors, as I said earlier, that hasn't even been brought into play. So to keep the IMC story going, innovation must continue. Credit to MPA for putting those words to this. We may be a small country physically, but we do have a maritime ecosystem that is considered supersized. It's like your hamburger, supersized. And so building on this, MPA has undertaken proactive transformation to create a conducive environment for startups and tech companies to be established here. And some of the more promising startups, BX, specialize in autonomous robotic solutions for underwater infrastructure, such as ship hull inspection and cleaning. Above water, we have Podcast, a startup that is working on making global supply chains more predictive through demand forecasting and real-time vessel and container tracking. Leveraging on our strengths in port and logistics, international tech startups are also drawn to Singapore. So you see the two pictures on the right, Venti and AI Drivers. Venti is US headquartered, AI Drivers headquartered in London-based, are involved in the development of self-driving prime mover vehicles, where these are the vehicles that are used inside the port to automate container transportation between different terminals at the Singapore port. And these are different from, if you have been to Tuas, different from the AGVs, which are purpose-built, you could say, purpose-built vehicles that are quite unlike these prime movers. Have a look at this and then you see what I mean. Okay, this is viewed through the windscreen of a fairly typical prime mover. You will not see it as being different from another prime mover you encounter in the PSA terminal, except that it's autonomous, meaning it doesn't have a driver that is actually actively manning the wheel. The challenge has always been in our weather, the noise data, a digital noise that's created by the elements, the unpredictability of the hard points of reference. The containers are always shifting, changing, and you don't have a building really, and the precision that is needed in a port in order to operate a crane over a container. But I wish them well in terms of conquering all these challenges and making it a commercially implementable solution. Today, there's about a dozen of these running around, so it's not just one vehicle showing you a video. Yeah. Now, these strategic shifts are taking place. The further ones in digitalization, AI, quantum computing, these are shifts that are increasingly felt. MPA has introduced initiatives such as Digital Port at SG to drive convergence in the traditionally separate port processes with the support of a single platform to achieve levels of efficiency that are already among the highest in the world. MPA is also encouraging new port services, for example, through the creation of maritime drone estate to utilize drones for new maritime users and applications. Now, the workforce of tomorrow is going to be different as well. Our aging profile is one condition, limited talent pool, but higher educational levels mean that we need to do things differently to ensure we have a competent and adequate workforce, hence the focus in this area. And the last structural shift to be acknowledged is, of course, the green transition, arguably the greatest challenge of our times. The maritime sector has an important role to play in the greening of global supply chains. And MPA has been very active in driving green transition, domestically as well as internationally. To grow Singapore's position as a global bunkering hub, preparation is taking place for a multi-fuel transition using green fuels like ammonia, hydrogen, methanol, and Singapore conducted the world's first ship-to-container ship methanol bunkering operation last year. And there are other exploits in this area as well. Internationally, there has been initiatives with like-minded countries to trial new fuels and new bunkering standards under the green and digital corridors. Now, these structural shifts are still evolving, and while we may not be certain as to how they will play out, it does not stop us from starting long now at the big picture level and turn these disruptions into positive forces for change at the business level. The next lecture, we'll talk about this. Now, stepping somewhat down from the macro strategy level, let's shift our attention to what actually happens in the marketplace. All these are great. Yeah? We want to create more jobs, a lot more value add, courses for people for upskilling and then building on technology capabilities and so on. Did it all play out well? And truth be told, everybody remembers 2020. As much as we tried to change, as much as our strategy is sound, it was not good enough. And we remember the times when our goods did not arrive, when the country was concerned about essential supplies and so on. And these were the headlines. I mean, the headlines was a mess. The call for resilience took the spotlight. Supply chain pain points were being highlighted by our manufacturers, by our distributors. Pressure for more transparency and digitalization. E-commerce was booming, but fulfillment was not keeping up. And the quickening awareness of the climate challenge and its implications on supply chain. In addition, cost was a huge concern. So the reality is that it shows that the supply chain ecosystem is very highly segmented. By nature, it's always been the case. And if you look at the picture from origin to transit to destination and consumption, there are many players involved. Some people touch the container, some people deal with the banking, some people deal with the regulations and compliance, dangerous goods declarations, things like that. It takes that whole village, that whole team to ensure a successful flow. And because it's highly segmented and fragmented, when supply chain was put to the test, it performed horribly because neither the system nor the join-up process worked well, neither was there the mindset for working together. Data was not shared, transparency was low, interoperability weak. So yes, we have a great strategy, but we need to be reminded, like what Peter Drucker, or what is associated with a saying by Peter Drucker, says, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So I kind of add the words execution. A culture and execution eat strategy for breakfast. It doesn't take away anything at all from the importance of having the right strategy. And what I described earlier about IMC ambitions and our ITM strategic choices, on the contrary, because of the fragmentation in supply chain, a solid strategy is totally essential. But where Singapore has been strong has been the ability to execute and inculcate a progressive mindset over time. But this must take place through the key players in the marketplace. The strategy and execution come together, and hopefully a strong mindset where the rubber really hits the road. So to discuss this, I'd like to share some vignettes from the PSA transformation journey. So I think you'll agree PSA is a key player in this ecosystem. In their response to confronting the disruptive forces beyond building mega berth and mega port, and what are they doing as far as total supply chain is concerned? PSA resolved, looking at all the various disruptive environmental triggers, that it should move from ports to become a supply chain orchestrator, and that's in a nutshell. Right? If you were to take stock of where PSA was just after the GFC, 2011-2012, started its international or global journey through a number of acquisitions for already 15, 18 years by then, and had a global port portfolio of about 28 terminals, varying sizes. But although it handled a lot of containers, about 1 in 10 in the world, it did not have any knowledge or involvement with the cargo that is in the container. And because of IR 4.0, because of the lines blurring between cargo owners and new digital natives coming into the supply chain system and traditional players, it felt that I need to understand this whole supply chain a lot better. So resetting the intuition was necessary and applicable. There were 3 key pivots at the time. One, shifting the focus just on the container itself to curiosity about the cargo. And cargo is changing. Think about the electric vehicle. The number of moving parts in the electric vehicle engine and drivetrain is about 1/10 the number of moving parts in the equivalent ICE car. Things were changing very rapidly. Automation in ports need to be augmented by a further understanding of the use of IR 4.0 technologies across the whole of supply chain. And certainly an understanding of the physical facilities beyond ports to be in the first mile and last mile is equally important. So PSA started to look with great interest and invested in facilities such as this. On the top left, you see a rail terminal in Europe. So it looks like a port, maybe acts to some extent like a port, but it's not near water, right? Barge terminal, so it's not a mega port. In fact, it's a very small ship, serves very small ships. And on to then getting closer to the cargo itself, a distribution center, Tuas Port Plus Hub, I explained that just now. And then even closer to touching the distribution of cargo itself, Fuzhou Auto Center, Auto Hub in China. These are the progressive steps of getting closer and closer to the cargo, and today the portfolio is a commingling of many such repeated investments. There's also the realization that it's not just having eyes on the cargo and being involved in the physical movement of the cargo, that trade, when you get beyond port supply chain, is all about trade. It's three-dimensional. First dimension is physical, then you have the financial dimension and the regulatory dimension. And here you see on the right-hand side are the pain points where there are shortcomings across these dimensions. Right? People are saying, I have no transparency, I can't do what I want because I don't exactly have the information I need. So PSA resolved to accelerate its journey into cargo solutions, acquiring more capabilities in the Port Plus area, meaning the extended supply chain, and in digital, as well as in logistics service providers. So very quickly, Antwerp is one of the early investments, 2002. It's the second largest port in the PSA portfolio, a flagship as well. A few years down the road, we were still investing in pretty much the same, but this is an emerging market. We have many ports in China, India, but this one is quite an exciting one in Saudi Arabia. And while it shows here that it's empty in the early years, but it is absolutely full and bursting right now. Bursting, I mean. And then 2016, PSA invested in CUIRC, China United International Rail Corporation, which has a portfolio of rail terminals like this throughout China, in fact, the largest of such networks, that enabled PSA to participate and support the development of the third G2G project. Afterwards, I'll show you a picture of Chongqing. But keeping to the same theme of being in intermodal, this is a very interesting one. It is in British Columbia, Canada, 300 kilometers east of Vancouver, and it's a place when PSA started was just a piece of land with a stream, so it's not quite open sea, with a stream, but more importantly, the two major railroads of Canada. It allowed PSA to play a strong transshipment role by setting up a hub base, offering services to petroleum, to Canadian Tire, whom you may know is the Walmart of Canada. And then, as I said, gave it the capability to start to embark on more ambitious projects. This is the Chongqing Distribution Center. Now, all these need new digital engines to drive them. PSA traditionally had a digital engine for driving the port and the interface between the port and the port users called PortNet. Now, when you go and own other facilities, if you don't have consistent and interoperable digital engines, you are buying more problem. To have the solution to the problem, you need to build more digital engines. And hence the acquisition of Crimson Logic, who was very strong already in trade facilitation at the time and had business in many countries, long experience, Singapore plus elsewhere. And finally, to get closer to the customer who uses the containers, i.e. the people who have the goods, PSA acquired PDP International in 2022. It's a US-based supply chain company, 5,000 over people, and present in just slightly under 140 offices. So the offerings that PSA was able to provide has changed dramatically. If you look at this, in the middle bar, it can now perform truly supply chain orchestration backed by the physical ownership and operation of a huge portfolio of ports. So it gives a high level of assurance. Transportation solutions, trade management and customs, port plus connectivity, contract logistics. And on top bar, you find very complex cargo that has very challenging supply chain problems, statements to be solved. And all enabled by a smart suite of products that are co-built between PSA and BDP. And that enables it to undertake mega projects, new types of projects, like in this particular case for ACC. ACC is a battery manufacturing company that is owned by Stellantis, Mercedes, as well as one of the subsidiaries of Total. And the requirements for battery supply chain is actually one that is still evolving. So PSA stood up to the test, PSA BDP, to the test to be able to offer all the dimensions of what was expected. So that's just a quick flow working through how PSA has changed in the services, in what they have, the services they offer. Time does not permit me to go through the other aspects of transformation which are so critical, especially the people dimension, because culture, beliefs, mindset, diversity, cross-border, all these are things that have to be dealt with when you're trying to move and change fast. And it's still work in progress, but so far I would say from what I have seen, so good. So now I've covered what MPA does at a macro level, country level, making sure that Singapore will always stay competitive and as a single solution be complete and resilient. But at the same time, how key players within the system, port operations, logistics, and many of the other maritime ecosystem players also need to keep improving in concert in order to keep up with the whole disruptive forces in the environment. And we'll talk more about that in the next lecture. I've got 2 minutes. I'm amazed that I actually still have 2 minutes. Okay. Oh, okay. The portfolio of PSA. I think it's quite nice to just look at it quickly. Geographically, you see that this was a portfolio in 2015. And fast forward 7 years, and this is a portfolio with a lot more points, right? So I go back. Can I? Yeah, 24 countries. My eyesight is so bad. 44 locations, 42 terminals. And then almost double the number in every line. I end with a story. This is a story about Panama vis-a-vis Singapore. It's not about extolling the virtues of one versus the other. Both have their strengths. But I bring up this story because both are very similar. How similar? Panama is a small country. Singapore is a small country. Okay. We are both very near the equator. We are 1 degree north. Panama is 8 degrees north. Now, we are 103 degrees east. Panama is 80 degrees west. So if you add the two, it's 183. If you put a needle through this ball called Earth, just roughly north of the equator, you might actually hit both of them at one time. And we are present as PSA in both those spots. But staying with the countries, very important aspect of it is each of them connect two oceans. We connect the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean. Panama connects the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. The way we do our maritime business, our role, however, differ in accordance with our legacy and our strength. And Panama has great engineering inherited from the past in the first canal, and then I was there to see the first canal. I mean, the ball bearing that moves the locks, not the bearing, the ball of the bearing is about that size, okay? So huge engineering 100 plus years ago, amazing feat of mankind. And they've just upgraded a few years ago and got their second set of locks and a canal upgrade. And so that's their strength. Because they're able to do that, they're able to command shipping traffic because ships have no choice but to flow through them. So once when I was with the president of Panama, at that time President Varela, we were both having the groundbreaking ceremony of our terminal. I said, President, please don't take it in a bad way. You have great strengths. You can collect toll. I can't. The ships have to go through you. In Singapore, the ships sail past us. We have to reel them in. And we have to create an innovative and evolving and all that but that is our strength. And I invited him to view our strengths. He did come to Singapore, and he looked at the way we train the workforce, ITE, so on and so forth, and we started to exchange. And so today they're working on their strengths, different business model. Our business, slightly more complicated, but again, have to continue to be evolved in accordance with our strengths. So the message is we all have to continue to innovate. The next change hasn't happened yet, but like one particular school group in Singapore says it as their motto, the best is yet to be. You had the words from my mouth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Tan. For those watching the lecture on Facebook, please submit your comments and questions through the Facebook comment box. For our audience members here, please step up to the mic to ask your questions. May I now invite Mr. Marcus Lam, Executive Chairman of PwC Singapore, to start the Q&A session. Mr. Lam, please.
Well done, sir.
Thank you, thank you.
So when Chong Meng asked me whether I can help to moderate, I can't wait because it's my chance to grill him. And so please make sure you give me more questions. He only wants to take tough questions because he never handled anything simple. And so I will start the ball rolling. Why? And just now he asked me, what am I going to ask him? And so I purposely going to ask him questions that I didn't ask him. So I think we hear the story of how PSA has transformed. Why? Really in reaction to the economic shift, but more importantly, maybe you sort of hasn't really give us a glimpse of how do you move the workforce of PSA, right, to handle this transformation, and yet able to keep the culture of PSA intact? And maybe there's something that we can learn from it.
Well, thanks, Marcus. As I said, we didn't have time to do that in the main lecture, so I'm actually quite happy with the question. A lot of credit has to go to the people. People who are willing to recognize that they need to shift, how the world has already started to evolve or has evolved beyond the assumptions that took us as far as we did, and be willing to subject themselves, ourselves, to having new ideas, new people in the room, diversity, because sometimes we always like our own buddy system, people we are familiar with for 20, 30 years, and new thinking, even new businesses. Expanding the scope of PSA's business from port to beyond ports and then to supply chain is not by any means a simple assumption that it's slam dunk, you just buy it and it happens. Because the acquisition was based on the belief that PSA can play a strong integration role. So to buy them and let them operate as separate parts of independent parts of a portfolio was not the answer. So indeed, the ambition, the challenge was great. I think what's important is that, as you said, the culture of the company must be strong and willing to embrace differences in people, willing to prioritize the individual, and willing to acknowledge as well the contributions of people as colleagues, as the workforce. And so I'm blessed in that even before I joined PSA, for about 10 years, there was already a very strong corporate culture foundation. It was built on the fish ideology that came from Seattle, Washington, so it's not even Singaporean, but it's actually quite global, where there was a fish market where the mongers would start the day in a very joyous mood by throwing fish at each other. And through that, they espouse 4 principles of making their day, play, and so on and so forth. Treasuring people for who they are in the same community. And when I came into PSA, I said, let's add to that, not just people for each other, but people for the business. So we added the elements of stretch, self-discipline, of trust, of support. That's what any company would need to do to ensure that you have the right emotion to go forward with. I'm sure most companies will have their formula, but the outcome then depends on whether they are executed well. Yeah. So I'm happy that we have a team who really believe in it, from not just the HR group, but the line management and all the various teams. So it's worked out well. During COVID, we faced our most challenging time when, for instance, we acquired a business in Peru, and you can't travel. You can't share with them what fish is, this and so. And things had to be done online. And yet, at the same time, yet in that acquisition, I found that the PSA culture was fairly well embedded within roughly about the same time, within about 6 months. So it was quite differentiating in that sense, that people felt that it was different and worth latching on to. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing. I think the other thing that you sort of touched on is about Tuas Port, which is
Oh, I should mention one more thing before you
Yeah.
get to Tuas. The unions are a very big part of our workforce. We have about 50,000 people, about 5,000 cargo solutions, 45,000 imports. And the unions form a big part of this. And when we went through the no ordinary disruption and had to tell people to shop hard and buy better roads, do whatever you want, spend the money, get into the digital economy, digital train, we included the unions. And we had dialogue sessions that were not just at, sometimes these strategy sessions are kept like at C-suite levels. We had C-suite, we have union, we have very diverse groups coming together. And it was amazing that the session with the unions was one of the most satisfying in terms of questioning how far we need to change in order to stay relevant.
I think what we hear about the culture is clearly, there's a strong core values, right, which is allowing you to expand globally but keeping the core values. Your involvement of not just from C-suite all the way from people on the ground. I think once you're able to get the heart and mind of the people, I think you can charge ahead and be adaptive to change. I think very good guidance that we can all take away. Just coming back to the question on Tuas Port, it's a mega investment. So if I could ask you, what do you think future-proof that Tuas Port?
Well, there are certain requirements for what an efficient future port would look like, and that must be the expectations that are set by the shipping lines, because they're first users, right, at the waterfront. Especially for Tuas. Tuas is 85%, 90% transshipment. So it's ship to ship. So first and foremost, it must check those boxes shipping lines put on Tuas. But not just as a destination or a place for transshipment, but as part of the shipping line's total network. Now, for them to plan how to transship a box that starts from, say, China and ends up in, say, Brazil, they will have to plan how they work themselves through maybe one transshipment, if not two, maybe even three, the hops, as it were. And they would need to have confidence that these transshipment locations would deliver the goods on time, on plan. Yeah? And because if you fail to connect in any one of these, we all know how it's like missing an airline connection. That's what happens to container ships as well. There's some really scary examples, I tell you, when one time the country of Bangladesh was short of onions, and because of the weather problems in India, the export of onions were curtailed by the country, and they had to buy from Turkey. And Turkey is not that far away relative to where India was, but the time to ship, because of all the various transshipments, was like 2 to 3 times. And so an SOS came up from the representatives in Bangladesh, gave me a call and said, can you help us to expedite? And one of the touch points was indeed Singapore. And we managed to change it by, well, a factor of a couple of weeks. Yeah. So being a player within the shipping line may not be truly aware of this, because for them it is an activity, it's a logistical activity. So we hope that by knowing the shipping lines requirements on international optimization of their routes and how they want to plan services, we can help them be more efficient and in that sense also bring more business to us. We also think that in future there will be a big reliance on data. So Tuas have to learn to harness the information that it has from its operations as well as the cargo flow, identify those patterns and use those patterns to help resolve the problems of beneficial cargo owners. An example, a lot of the chemical products that come from, say, one of Middle East countries, you can guess who, it goes to Asia and goes to China, actually comes through Singapore. They have other choices that are perhaps cheaper. But what happens in Singapore is the ability to help them to inventory manage while the product is in a container. You don't even need to get to the warehouse. So the port operates as a warehouse. But if you do need the warehouse as a regional distribution center, well, today, Pasir Panjang doesn't have it. We don't have the land for it. Tuas in future will have it. So you saw that big project called Tuas Port Plus Hub. So you have multiple ways to resolve a shipping line optimization challenge, distribution challenge by a cargo owner, or other types of issues that may come our way. And I think by the time Tuas is finished, Terminal 4, which will actually be Terminal 1, this formula for what is good enough that I'm just expressing would already be outmoded, superseded, right, by the challenges of the time.
I think we, sure.
It's Alistair here. Thank you so much for sharing. The question that I have is that we talk about trade routes and we talk about how Singapore can remain competitive, efficient, catch up ports and so forth. But what if, for example, melting ice caps, you have the Northern Atlantic kind of trade routes that are being opened, or you have the Kra Canal that, recently there was a discussion on that as well. So what happens when there are new trade routes and how can we still continue to be competitive? Is efficiency or having warehouse even enough? Or what else can we do? And the other part to the question is, we always say, or we tend to say that as ASEAN, when the region benefits, we ourselves will also benefit at the same time. So what is the balance between measuring our own interests versus, for example, new trade routes, Kra Canals, and so forth? Then how can we still be part of the game as well? So two parts of the question. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Alistair. Those are very thought-provoking questions, very important ones. First, maybe deal with the one closest to home. We talk about Kra. The Isthmus of Kra, yes, had two ideas that were floated around. One was a canal, and I say was because that was an older idea. Very complex, challenging. You need to be quite deep. I think engineering-wise, if you think about, say, the Suez Canal or the Panama Canal, unlike Panama, where you're really talking about locks in certain parts of the whole movement between the two oceans, in Kra case, you have to punch through the whole isthmus. And so, very expensive. And then you say, what is the merit? The merit in the case of Panama is avoidance of Cape Horn. Here, you're talking about Straits of Malacca. And so, all things considered, I think it is quite costly. Secondly, there are many ships that come through and down the Straits of Malacca that actually don't call Singapore, because it could be a commodity ship that is shipping an energy commodity from, say, a Middle East to a Northeast Asian customer that may not stop here. And so I would say there are candidates where it makes sense to go through if the cost formula is right. I think Singapore should continue to work on being competitive for people who need an active, dynamic trade, manufacturing, and transshipment hub, as a maritime service. And if, let's say, alternative ports are, you don't have to wait for Kra. Hey, Tanjung Pelapas, Klang, they're all there already. Now, how can we continue actually to be competitive? We already have those. Today, I think the idea in Thailand is a little bit more leaning towards a land bridge. So it's being discussed. We'll see what happens. Melting ice and all, I think indeed, if we don't cope with climate change well and the climate disturbances are as people predict, then we we already see carving of ice floes, right? And so it may open up new routes. And if the shipping industry is such that you get the jurisdictions, the law, the insurances and all that, then there can be new routes. But the container shipping business is actually less of a point-to-point business, much not like an express bus, much more like a normal bus. You pick up, add on passengers, let go some, and so on. So you need economic stations along a particular corridor to make a route work. Otherwise, it's point-to-point. So I think the commodity type shipment, which are more point-to-point, may benefit from a direct route. Who wouldn't? If you're shorter and cheaper, why not, right? But if you need services, one final thought is that, London doesn't have a very big shipping activity. Previously, it was a maritime capital of sorts. Tokyo is not a very big maritime center, but yet it shows up as one of the IMC contenders. So I think we have to be diligent. We have to look at everything that we have. That's why I brought an example of Panama. If it's not your strength, too bad. But if it is your strength, keep working on it to make sure that you don't let go of anything that you have.
Thank you. We have a lady for a
Yes,
question.
please. My name is Helena True. I've been standing here for the past 18 minutes.
Sorry.
I apologize to the people behind whom I'm blocking. Yeah, so let me start with my question. I want to thank you, Chong Meng, for your presentation. So my question really is, why do we do what we do? Is our pursuit simply chasing after Shanghai? In your chart, 2008 and 2018 comparison chart, beyond the tech companies leading the pack, we have our visionary leaders with a purposeful problem-solving excellence. Steve Jobs inculcated a legendary, living, liberating culture of creative innovations. Steve Jobs was unperturbed even when Apple trailed behind Microsoft. Yeah, so given the difference between visionary leaders and maintenance managers, will you, Chong Meng, and your teams be open to perspectives and transformative ideas from outside of your current alliances and associations to collaboratively work with women like me? And together we can light up not just St. Peter's Square, but as purposeful, life-giving stewards of co-existential human dignity instead of competition-only environment in IMC, and truly be the undouseable light from Singapore to the world. Fratelli tutti. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sorry to keep you waiting. Marcus,
Sorry.
It's terrible, are you?
No, I apologize. It's my fault, not yours. I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, that is a very deep question. The why we do what we do and what do we want to accomplish. I think Singapore as a country needs to maintain its relevance and its competitive vibrancy. And so there are just those requirements that ensure that, let's say if you want to keep strong, keep your position in the maritime space, there are a number of levers that you need to consider and certainly need to expand or exploit them in order to do the best you can. Outcomes, the maritime ecosystem does support a lot of jobs. Many companies who call Singapore home, who have formed their operational headquarters but then have jobs for Singaporeans, and contribution to GDP is also fairly significant. The value add beyond a maritime ecosystem is hard to count. I mean, MTI may or may not relate, for instance, the port to a lot of the manufacturing activities. It's not so easy to count. But as a whole, I would say it is north of 7%, which is in maritime, but then you add some of the other value adds. So I think there's an economic case. It also makes Singapore, I would say, proud, not just to rest on the laurels of your location, but make the most of the location. To some extent, demonstrate that you can be a solution provider when there is a challenge to be solved, whether it's within our region, Southeast Asia, or be noticed by the world that Singapore is a positive contributor to global growth, global solution forming. And to some extent, that's also why people come here and sign up shipping corridor initiatives for green and digital shipping, because our reputation is one of being collaborator to create those solutions. Now, granted, everything I've described is still focusing on the attributes of improving ourselves within the industry. And I am not sure I fully understand your question where it relates to the non-commercial, non-industrial part. But I would surely welcome the opportunity to discuss and say what working with women like you mean. I mean, I really don't understand. So we can discuss and say, and talking about taking on new diverse ideas and inspirations, I think we all have to, yes.
I'm waiting to ask this question.
Sorry.
Thank you. Can I have your card, please?
I'll write to you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
God bless you. Thank you so much.
Sorry, maybe I have the guy in green first.
Yeah, firstly, thank you, Mr. Tan, for the speech. I'm from DH Singapore. Okay, my first question is relating to sustainability and specifically green corridors. Could you just provide some color on what exactly is a green corridor? What does it mean? How does it sort of come about in terms of the decision to implement one? The requirements needed for a green corridor. And at the end of the day, do you have an estimation on the impact on global emissions from shipping, which are currently hovering around 2 to 3%? That's my first question for you. Thank you.
Okay. Can I invite you to my third lecture? Really, seriously. We're going to deal with this.
When is that, sorry?
Huh?
When is that, sorry?
It's on May, the first week of May, sometimes 6 or 8. But we'll get, 7th. 7th of May.
I won't be in Singapore, but I'll send a colleague down.
The video.
Yeah, it's okay. There'll be a video recording for you.
Okay,
Sorry.
okay, great.
Yeah.
Then I'll just move on to my second question,
Sure.
which is really on what is sort of the, of course this is from a shipping perspective, what is sort of the impact of US sanctions on China over the past few years? How has that sort of impacted Singapore? Has it been positive? Has it been negative? And how has Singapore sort of adapted to this change in dynamic, if you will?
Well, I would say maybe extend the question to beyond, say, directly sanctions, to one of where is the world shifting in terms of people's concern about, supply chain exposures. If my manufacturing were in one place, I'm trying to reach that market, what are the implications if there's a geopolitical tension? Alternatively, if there are then people who are concerned about carbon footprint, is there an alternative way to refashion a supply chain? So I'd say that there are multiple forces that are driving the change, but certainly two outcomes that we have discussed last lecture, and I think will continue is one, the movement to other market locations like Vietnam, like India, and so on, talking about the China plus one strategy, partly also because of the merits of the marketplace itself. Vietnam and India will be their own marketplace. And secondly, the idea of getting closer to the ultimate destination market. So I talk about friendshoring and reshoring, and Mexico being a beneficiary of, US demand relocating their production centers or final assembly centers to Mexico. So I think it's happening. Some are more relatable, but some are, I think, just the general shift of industrial supply chain management.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your excellent presentation, Mr. Chong, Mr. Tan. First question, you mentioned about forecasting near-term and long-term, 2 years and 10 years, and the trend to overestimate 2 years and underestimate 10 years. Okay, what were the reasons for that, if any, in terms of the pattern of that overestimation and underestimation? Okay. Second question, it's got to do with data and climate change. Choke points like Panama Canal and Suez Canal, if you take the Panama Canal, it's linked to the rainfall, the drought that sometimes occurs in this part of the world. And with the prevalence of numerous points of data, right? I mean, you have an abundance of data coming in, you know. How do you discern that kind of pattern to increase resilience in your supply chain? Because you already have visibility, right, from end to end. But these things like climate change patterns would have to depend on rainfall patterns and so forth. How is that built into your algorithm for predicting such kind of events? Right. I think the third question's got to do with the change in the value add of the world's top 10 companies from resource-based to tech-based platform companies. How does that impact on your transformation on the PSA model as a whole? Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. So the first one is about what Bill Gates said, so he should give you the answer, not me. But I think it's just a human tendency to be more sensitive to the signals that are more present and around us. Our forecast of the future is much more dependent on what's actually happening today than what happened 5, 10 years ago, or what we think will happen 5, 10 years hence. So we always start, any financial forecast start from where we are. Actually, that's not quite right. You've got to look at the long-term view. So it's just I would say, a tendency to do that. I don't know whether anybody has made an analysis of right or wrong. Maybe it's more empirical than that, but I think it is logical. The second one on climate change and how we take in data to impact our midterm, long-term. And then long-term, we are in the business of building infrastructure that has to last a long, long, long time. It's like the country infrastructure, port infrastructure, tuas infrastructure, you build, you better be good under whatever scenario. So for that, I think you have to be much more using data that are able to support your scenario dissections. And you then make a commercial decision as to what scenario dissection, meaning this type of scenario on so much climate change and how high the deck should be and how high seawater will rise in your commercial decision making. You can't totally ignore it. In fact, you will not be allowed to totally ignore it. But then how high is high? I think you have to use information as much as possible. In the short term, and even on real-time basis, there's a lot of information that with today's new generation AI, you're able to bring together with hard-coded data, machine-learned data, to formulate new understanding. And in PSA BDP suite of services, there's this thing called a smart navigator, for example, which is able, and other companies that are also equally able to do that, I must say. But the ability is one of, for instance, demonstrating to a customer, you have 10 supply centers, and it's a real case, 10 supply centers and 40 distribution or receiving centers in Europe. Is it by barge, is it by rail, and not just the cost, the carbon, or you can also include the risk of riots, of so on. So whether it's long-term or short-term, you're right. If you have the system to build a good data sphere that can be used for knowledge, it can make a difference, and in future, that's where it should be. And what's the third question?
Last question. No, that was the previous. The last one was the 10. So if you look at in 2008 and 2018.
Okay, the 10-year challenge.
10,
Yeah, I mean, that is thank you very much. That is an outcome of, we use that as an outcome to kind of think backwards, to say, was it a dramatic change? And if you peel the onion of that dramatic change, what truly is happening? And from there, the distillation says that, as part of all these shifts, and with IR 4.0, some of the key inferences were, one, that cargo itself will not stay the same. We can't always imagine that the way to make this cup and the supply chain needed to make this cup will stay the same. Cargo will not be the same. I gave the example of EV, but that's a technological shift. There are many other potential examples that the technology that disrupt can also enable. And from all that, to determine what is the technology space as well as the business space we should be in. So it was much more as a sort of a symptomatic observation. So it wasn't one where we specifically look at these 10 winning companies in 2018, study their strategy and be like them. It was more to say things are different. What are the implications for us in our industry?
Okay, don't hold our friend back. So maybe I'll take that as last question. You got one more question? Okay, because I have two more questions here. So after that is you. So we have to travel Chong Meng to stay around for a while.
Okay, make it shorter then. me, I'll make it shorter. Sorry.
Yeah, Satya from SMBC here. I'll have only one question. Thank you for the very wide-ranging and thought-provoking presentation. When you described the transition from a port operator to a supply chain orchestrator, you demonstrated the shift, literally when you showed those numbers of PSA locations, more than doubling and in some cases trebling in terms of activity. I could not help but imagine that you're actually a multinational, probably Singapore's widest ranging multinational headquartered out of Singapore. My question to you is this transition on the physical space that you achieved as a global player now, what has that meant in terms of people, in terms of culture, in terms of mindset, even the point you made about strategy to execution, because all of these different countries and their ports, they all have different cultures. And I know the port industry is a very, very steeped in tradition, the unions and so on. How did you achieve this transformation, firstly? And secondly, is this a future roadmap for large Singapore companies to not just worry about Singapore, but about their international workforce and build a roadmap for Singaporeans to become global in their aspirations? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, the second question is a more straightforward one. I don't know. I think the experience in PSA was one which PSA forged for itself. Myself, together with the leadership team, we built it, embraced it, and moved forward with it. The answer for other companies, while the goals may be similar, but the how-to, I think, really will depend on the company, the leadership, and where they are. And I do see some companies already doing this, but in different ways. The reason why I say I don't know is because I don't know in great detail and depth exactly what's their winning formula. The winning formula must include a people strategy. That's a given. And that people strategy, we all know the destination of the people strategy. It's an aligned group of people who believe in the company's vision, to whom the vision and mission are clear, that they are willing to wear on their sleeve and hold another person as a co-worker towards that. That's simple articulation. They have to support each other, trust each other, so the principles are clear. And what do you do to constantly reflect those principles and earn the confidence with authenticity across multiple cultures and languages? That is the challenge. And I think the best way to explain it is in seeing it. So maybe you can talk to PSA folks and have them give you and PSA does learn as well from other people, so it's not just one way, right?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Tan, for sharing this session with us. Would you perhaps comment on the shallowing of the Malacca Straits? How serious is the shallowing of the waters along the Straits of Malacca? Has PSA done any contingency scenario planning with respect to perhaps the blocking of the Malacca Straits? Secondly, does PSA work with our immediate neighboring port operators? Because from a grassroots perspective, it seems that in Southeast Asia, the different port operators are more or less chasing after the same piece of cake. So is there any way where we could work closer with our immediate neighbors to share the cake amongst us? And finally, this is basically my concerns. And finally, I'm sorry. How do you justify the price premium that Singapore charges? Because as we are passing the time, every day we are being challenged with lower cost competitors in the region. Thank you.
Okay. The shallowing of Malacca Straits, I would say, is more of a MPA problem, or not MPA problem, but an issue to be addressed by MPA rather than by PSA. Firstly, because if you look at the draft of ships that plow the Malacca Straits, the container ships are by far not the deepest. The deeper ships are the bulkers, the commodity ships, like the oil tankers, where they get down to 27 meters. A typical container ship at deepest draft is like 17 to 18 meters. So while not of immediate concern to PSA in terms of the draft, but if the channel is made narrower, if the capacity is reduced, of course it's something that we should be concerned about. I would say up to now, from what we have seen, heard, or understood, that constraint on the container shipping side has not been one significant enough to put in our current planning scenario. That's one. The second question you have is about sharing the cake with neighbors. In our neighborhood, there are a few large transshipment ports and many mid-size to small-size local ports. So if you think about the coastline in Southeast Asia, the coastline per economy is very high. So Indonesia, lots of islands, so many, many coastlines. So shipping is indeed a preferred way of transporting goods because you have lots of coastline. They're not connected. It's not like an American landmass, a European landmass, where the coastline per economy is much less. Here we are islands and peninsulas and also with lots of coastline. So shipping will be key, but it also means that because shipping needs to be versatile, there are many such small locations. They don't necessarily compete for the same type of business, transshipment business as we do. The competition then comes from like Malaysian ports and potentially in future in Vietnam or Thailand, but Thailand is a bit up in the bay. And we right now are serving the shipping lines almost to, I would say, optimal utilization. So even if we want to share, it's not like, in a sense, not like a situation where we are all underutilization and we have quite a kind of trade market share. Right now, I think the demand is reasonable and supply and capacity is also complementary. Even in the future, I would say there is a stronger tendency in the port industry to compete commercially. And a place where I would say maybe we can share is in knowledge, in general environment, in the areas that we are not immediately commercial sensitive. The shipping lines as well want to ensure that we do compete with each other to give them the best possible offer. So I'd say, it's quite specific in terms of the ports you're referring to, not so many. And the tendency would be to continue in a competitive mode. And finally, the question about
how to stay competitive.
How to stay competitive
Yeah.
given our price premium, right?
Yeah.
A price is subject to transactional price discovery, meaning that you discover the price by negotiation, and Singapore will not be able to charge sustainably beyond the value that it creates. Well, that's a one-liner, to be frank. Something will break, right? Something will break if you charge well beyond the value you create. So there's always a point, a bit of a sweet spot. Yeah. So far, that sweet spot has enabled the development of the TUAS structures, but it's not easy. Yeah.
Okay, I have two last questions that I want to cover, make sure that I don't miss out. One question, interestingly, you say, how about, is there a possibility for us to internationalize Singapore, changing from a maritime nation to a logistic nation, orbiting the whole globe?
Or the last sentence, last part of the sentence?
Essentially, is there a possibility for Singapore not just being a maritime nation, but being a logistic nation to serve the whole world? It's
I think Singapore does want to attempt to be more relevant on the digital trade side. So you have heard that trade is very physical from history, from legacy. But today there is the opportunity to be more involved in the non-physical part of the trade, even if it's done beyond your borders. If you have companies that are associated with it from within Singapore. So it's a little bit more borderless. So this concept of digital trade concepts for the future, I think is something that we can continue to explore and push forward. Otherwise, physical logistics, you would indeed, I would say the PSA network belongs to Singapore, if you like. And so it is a Singapore fabric beyond the maritime center. Having said that, I would say it cautiously because I think everybody wants to feel that they own a piece of their own action.
One last question, this one, also interesting question. I think we know about the decline of Hong Kong port. So I think the question is, what lessons can we learn from it?
That is. I think if you look at it from, say, a third person in a very neutral way and not try to explore nuances and don't draw too much influence, simply the market is in China, and China has created very big ports that is able to replace what Hong Kong does, to the extent that it may, I'm sure they have done their sums, be found that further development of future ready port in Hong Kong itself is not as attractive as having those facilities in China, in South China. So some operators have locations in both Hong Kong and China, and they can choose to invest in one or the other. The fact that they have allocated more resources to invest in the Hong Kong side is somewhat reflective of, I'm sure, some commercial realities. So,
thank you. So, really want to thank Chong Meng really for spending time with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tan and Mr. Lam. We've come to the end of today's lecture. We would like to hear your views on the event. Please click our link on the Facebook feed or scan the QR code on the screen to submit your feedback. Mr. Tan Chong Meng's third and final lecture, titled Sustainable and Resilient Trade, The Next Frontier, will take place on 7 May. Details will be on our website and IPS Facebook page. We hope to see you then. Thank you.